Greetings from Sri Lanka. On behalf of the Sri Lanka Technological Campus, I warmly welcome all of you for our fourth International Perspective webinar. We have invited three young professional librarians from the USA. They are going to talk about a very interesting topic. So for today's session, we have more than 450 participants from 12 countries, namely India, Pakistan, United Arab Emirates, Nigeria, Taiwan, Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Bangladesh, Kazakhstan, Germany, Australia, and Sri Lanka. My name is Hasita Korlage. I'll be the session moderator today. Once again, I welcome all of you for the session. Now let me introduce today's the guest of honor for the sessions today, Dr. Rwand Gamake. Dr. Rwand Gamake is the acting director of the National Institute of Library and Information Sciences in the University of Colombo, and he is the president-elect of the Sri Lanka Library Association. Dr. Rwand Gamake is a senior lecturer in Library and Information Science, and also he is an IT expert. So thank you very much for being with us, sir. Over to you.
Thank you, Hasita. Very welcome to all of you, and greetings from Sri Lanka. I'm Rwand Gamake, Acting Director, National Institute of Library and Information Sciences, University of Colombo. This is commonly named as NILIS. So I'm representing over 10,000 libraries from Sri Lanka, mainly 8,000 school libraries. And over 1,200 public libraries. And the recent pandemic time, we were, I think, all libraries were physically closed. And during this time, there was an interesting observation. From one side, the readers were at home. They desperately needed the libraries. They needed something to read. The other hand, the libraries were physically closed and they were not accessible. But at the same time, there were service providers, the content providers. They opened their content for some extent. It may not be sufficient for all the readers, but at least for some, this was the content was available. So from one hand, there were content, and the other hand, there were readers. But I observed that there were some gaps. Let aside the gaps related to internet access, the devices, the content, the technology, but there was the inability to communicate these resources, the linkage between the resources and the readers due to non-building of online communities. So libraries were specialists having all this content. I think from developed countries, of course, the libraries were at least virtually open, but other countries who had not built the virtual communities already, they were lacking in modes of communication between the readers and the communicating these resources available to the readers. They were dispersed. So these dialogues between the debates on closed access versus open access and open copyright and copyleft, all are very much important and necessary and relevant. At the same time, we should be thinking of building communities to communicate this, what we have. So that is the justification for existence of libraries. Of course, we, the librarians, are the technology experts and the content experts. So they can communicate these things only when the online communities had been built. So at this point, I stopped paving way for the guest speakers uh, for continuing the discussion, but that we all have to, the message I want to give is that we want to build communities as soon as possible before the next crisis arises. So thank you very much for inviting me for giving the opening remarks, especially to SLTC and Mr. Hasita. So have a great day. Enjoy the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rwand. Now we have come to the most important part of the session. Let me introduce our esteemed guest speakers, Dr. Raymond Fon, Laurie Bridges, and Roberto Artiaga. Dr. Raymond Fon is an instruction and research librarian from Graduate School of Education. He has published, edited volumes of student engagement and learning in academic librarianship, including the First Year Experience Cookbook and the Sustainable Libraries Cookbook. Both have been published by the Association of College and Research Libraries, ALA. Dr. Ray is an active member of American Library Association as well as IFLA. Let me talk about Laura Bridges. Is an instruction and outreach librarian, associate professor from the Oregon State University Library. She has written numerous articles and chapters and co-authored a book. Recently, she has focused her research and outreach effort on Wikipedia. Roberto Artiaga is an instruction reference librarian from Pacific Lutheran University. His work draws from institutional design and the scholarship of teaching and learning, and his research interests are created in developing critical approaches to teaching information literacy. We welcome all of you to Sri Lanka Technological Campus. So thank you very much for being with us today. And there's a general reminder for participants. So if you have any questions, please drop it on the Q&A poll. So with the limited time, we will select some of the questions based on first come, first serve basis. So we will try out our best to answer all these questions. Thank you very much. And the session is over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Hasita. We want to extend our thanks to you and the team for organizing this session and hosting us to give this opportunity to talk about this publication. Also want to thank Dr. Gamake for his opening remarks. It was very, very informative and connects really well to what we're talking about. And so I'm Ray Pan. As mentioned in introduction, I'm a librarian out in California. And today we'll be talking about three main points that I think would be of interest to participants here. First point, we'll be looking at open access and Wikipedia. The second point, we'll be looking at this publication of drawing on those two areas. And then finally, we'll have a conversation about the approach that we're taking with open access and Wikipedia and academic libraries, as all of us are working in that area. And so before I begin, I just wanted to ask that there is a chat feature that I believe is available to all participants, and really wanted to ask if we could just take a moment. We have a couple of questions we want to ask the audience here, and the first question here is, what kind of librarian are you? Are you an academic librarian, a school librarian, a public librarian, a special librarian working in government, medical, law, or some other type of library or information center? And I believe that there should be a chat feature here that's open to all participants. I'm not sure if there's a way for us to see it. I see the live Q&A box. So I'll give it a few moments here before we proceed. Laurie, Roberto, do you see anything? Okay. So that was one of our polls. We wanted to just see what type of background that our participants have. And in addition, we were really curious about your OA experience and your Wikipedia experience. So keep that in mind when we're talking about these two different areas, yet they're also interconnected. So what we're doing today is we're going to have a conversation about this process and what it means to be academic librarians working with OA and Wikipedia. So first I'll pass it to Roberto so he can give you his thoughts on it.
Hello, everyone. So, well, this is going to be a conversation. I'm going to be in charge of giving a bit of context about our book, which Laura is going to talk about. So for the next few minutes, I want to briefly talk about open access and Wikipedia. I'll focus mostly on open access, though. So open access, as defined in Wikipedia, is a set of principles and a range of practices through which research outputs are distributed online, free of cost, and other access barriers. So I picked this definition because one is from Wikipedia, and because it lets me address open access in a more general way. Plus, it calls open access what it actually is, which is a set of principles and a set of practices, and not just a way to publish academic articles. But before I go any further, I want to provide a short overview of open access. So my research is not entirely on open access. This is something that I'm interested in. So this is just a fairly broad overview. And in gathering this information, I took from sources from different disciplines and even Wikipedia. So some of this information is also from the History of Open Access Wikipedia page. So scholars, I believe mostly computer scientists, have been self-archiving, which is itself a form of open access, since about the 1970s. But self-archiving became more popular when arXiv, .org became more popular around the early 1990s. And from then, open access has seen a growth in adoption, particularly in the early 2000s. However, adoption has not been as wide as it could be, and adoption across all fields has not been equal. So, but nowadays, it is not uncommon to see small or large journals provide open access alternatives to their authors. And similarly, authors of either big or small authors are able to publish their work in open access repositories, as well as self-archive their work under Creative Commons licenses. There have been attempts to make open access a global priority, but that's still a work in progress. But a couple notable examples are the Budapest Open Access Initiative from 2002, or the Berlin Declaration of Open Access from 2003. Both of these have set the foundation for what open access has become by calling for self-archiving or open access journals in order to increase access to information and knowledge and reduce any financial, legal, or technical barriers. When it comes to open access, the topics of access and cost are often the focus, and they are also very much interconnected. So like I mentioned, the open access movement is interested in increasing access because that would let a bigger number of people read a particular work without having to be part of an academic institution or having a subscription to a journal, which is what most traditional publications do. However, access also has to do with the impact of academic publications, and this is particularly important for those of us in positions that must demonstrate our scholarly and academic impact. When it comes to cost and open access, that's a larger topic, but I want to say just in short that open access publications are not free and in fact cannot be free. And what I'm saying here is that even if the resources, the open access resources that you access are free or offered at a low cost, the publications or services that house those resources will always have to be funded by someone or by some organization. And that's where OA may start to lose some of that support. After all, as is the case for our publication, the burden of the cost is sometimes put on the authors, on the authors ourselves. And as you can expect, not everyone is able to do this. So it gets really difficult there. So until institutions, organizations, and governments begin to intentionally fund open access initiatives, not just through grants, which is what we're trying to do, open access, I think, may continue to remain as just an alternative to traditional publishing. After all, it costs to write and peer review an article, it costs to edit a book, it costs to design a book cover, and it costs to host this electronic file. So the cost has to come from somewhere, and volunteer or self-funded efforts can only go so far. So that's
let me
just a, go ahead.
I was going to pause you for a second and just ask, so what is, so you've thank you, Roberto, for giving that great summary. So what, like, why does it matter? Like, why should, if there's sort of like all these sort of factors you're describing?
Hopefully I get there in a minute.
Okay.
So that's just a very quick introduction to open access. Want to transition briefly into Wikipedia for a moment, which is something also that we're talking about in a bit. I'm not going to spend too much talking about that because I feel that Wikipedia is at a spot where people now in general understand what it does, when to use it, and when it's most appropriate to use it. So I won't say much there, but I think Wikipedia is still quite useful if you use it as you're intended to. If you use it as you're intended to use it, but just like everything else, it requires that you look at it from a critical eye. And just to close this section, one of the goals of the Wikimedia Foundation is to, I guess, to empower, and this is their mission, to empower and engage people around the world to collect and develop educational content under a free license or an open public domain, and to disseminate it effectively and globally. And one difference that exists, however, between open access and Wikipedia is that Wikipedia already has found a level of acceptance and understanding to a certain level, and open access has still yet to reach that turning point. So the success that Wikipedia has found in facilitating and disseminating information, not just in the West side of the world, but also across the globe. And I believe that this is what we require for a way to garner more support. So those of us in the West need to try to widen our scholarly and our social networks and look beyond the areas and look beyond just the areas of where we work. And that's one of the hopes that our publication has. But with that, I pass it to Laurie, but does that answer some of the question that you had, Ray?
Yeah, it certainly does. The questions, really we were trying to address is what is and why OA is important, sort of looking at the impact. Hopefully that gives you some idea why it's so important for us as academic librarians to think about OA in our work as librarians when we do scholarship, but also when we support faculty, teaching faculty in the sciences and the humanities on how they publish their content in open access format. However, the challenges are still there, right? Because as Roberto pointed out, that just like Wikipedia that I've seen, a lot of teaching faculty still have some kind of concern using the content, whether having their students to use it or having themselves to be participant of such work because they see it as open. It's not necessarily authoritative or credible, as we've seen a lot of stuff that's been channeling through a lot of social media that sort of filters through in the sort of openness of the discussion. But it's really important, as we're discussing right now, why open access is so important for our work, to understand the workflows of how we design, manage, and produce scholarship in this information ecosystem that's rapidly changing. So three of us, we had worked together to think about a publication that would address the needs of open access Wikipedia and our work as academic librarians. So we have Laurie. She'll say a little bit more about how the book got started. It hasn't come out yet, so she'll explain a little bit about it, but the book itself and the contributions and so forth. So I'll pass it to you, Laurie.
Great, thank you. So as Ray and Roberto have said, the OA piece is very important. And as most people now have a general idea about Wikipedia. Wikipedia is open and it is licensed under a CC BY license. And so anyone can use it anywhere. You could even download it, the entire Wikipedia in all the languages, you can download it to a disk. And so there are remote locations in schools where students are able to access Wikipedia without the internet. So that's been set up around the world. And so the way this book got started really is that a few years ago, I was sitting with my son, who at the time was like 9, and he was using Wikipedia in school. And as a university librarian, I started thinking about, oh, if children are using Wikipedia, and I know that university students are using Wikipedia, maybe I should, as a librarian, really start diving into it so that I can teach students and work with people about what is Wikipedia related to information literacy. And as I dove more into it, I decided this is what I want to focus on because it is what everyone's using. And if we can teach people more about Wikipedia, they will become better consumers of information outside of Wikipedia. And so as I was doing my research and diving in, I was reading articles. Of course, some of them were OA articles. And there's one book about Wikipedia, and that book is called Leveraging Wikipedia, Connecting Communities of Knowledge. And it was put out by the American Library Association. And it's a great book. I strongly encourage you to read it, but it is not OA. And in fact, the book is $70 in the US. I looked it up. That is 13,000 Sri Lankan rupees. So it's not a cheap book. And when I'm reading a book, I like to own it and touch it, and I like it to be affordable. And if I can, I'll print it from the web. And so as I started talking with Ray and Roberto, we were talking about books and how it would be great if there was a book focused on academic libraries, because leveraging Wikipedia is focused on all libraries. And there's no book for academic libraries yet. So how could we fill that gap and be in line with Wikipedia, which is open information for the world? So we wanted to keep those things aligned. And then that's really how we got launched and began discussing moving forward with this book. And I'll say too that I come with no experience editing a book. I have had chapters in books. I think Roberto has as well. Have you published in a? And Ray has edited several books, but this is all our first experience publishing and editing an open access book. And so it's come with its own unique challenges. So I'll dive a little bit into about the book if you're interested to know more. So first, I do want to say that Wikipedia is worldwide. And one of the questions we had, if anyone is able to answer, is in what languages do you use Wikipedia? So perhaps you use it in English, but there are many minor languages, which actually are not so minor and have millions of people, speakers, Wikipedias as well. And so librarians around the world work with Wikipedia, and it's supported some places and it's not supported in other places. So as Ray and I and Roberto look around, we saw librarians in other countries doing interesting things and projects that we didn't know about or we hadn't heard about in the US. So wouldn't it be great to share the stories and best practices around the world to help create enthusiasm for Wikimedia and also just the best practices of what we can do with it ourselves. So we did a call for chapter proposals, and we received proposals from around the world, and we chose 20 because that was our agreement with our publisher, was to have 20 chapters. So we chose 20 chapters, and we are hoping to have the book published in the spring. Right now, all the chapter authors are out writing their chapters, and they are coming in. And just so you know, the countries those chapters are coming from are Brazil, Canada, Hong Kong, Ireland, Kyrgyzstan, Mexico, Netherlands, Nigeria, Spain, the United Kingdom, and the United States. So those are the different countries, and they cover topics such as editathons. If you've heard of an editathon, it's a Wikipedia event where everyone gets together to write and edit about one topic, and many librarians, public and academic, do those. Also a chapter about digital citizenship, working with students in the classroom, pedagogical theories, and boosting gaps in underrepresented information. So just quickly, I'll say that you may or may not know that English Wikipedia studies have been done, and it is edited, which means created, by different people. Anyone can edit it, as you've probably heard, but 90% of those editors are estimated to be white males in the usually the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. So there are attempts to diversify who is writing and publishing articles. And I teach a class about Wikipedia, actually a 2-credit class, and this is one of the things we discuss. How does information flow around the world, and what does it mean when one group is predominantly making the information in Wikipedia that's shared globally? So hopefully this book will encourage people to start thinking about Wikipedia and working to add and diversify the information there. And so that's really one of our goals of the book, is to excite librarians, to add information that isn't already out there, and to connect one another for those of us who are working with Wikipedia.
Great, thanks, Lori. Do you want to mention the press a little bit?
Press, yes. So I'll talk a little bit about some complications. Like, doing an OA book is wonderful and fascinating, but there's so many difficulties and challenges that I did not really know about. I've published OA journal articles. If you've done that, you know you write it, there's a process, you submit it, it's accepted or rejected. But with a book, Ray, Roberto, and I are the co-editors, and we've put together some peer reviewers, and we went and found a press. So we looked around, we submitted our book idea to several presses, and we eventually settled on Mays Books, which is an arm of University of Michigan Publishing. And as Roberto said, publishing is not free. And so they do it at cost, so not for profit. But the US cost is about $4,500. And that's for their copy editing, typesetting, indexing, promotion. They create the DOI. They will print it and disseminate the print copies to libraries for us. And they estimate the print copies will be about $30 US dollars, which is less than half the cost of the other book I'd mentioned. And that's because, again, it's not a for-profit. And getting the funding has been interesting because I did not think it would be that difficult. But we've had to apply for a lot of little grants. So I'm putting together a lot of little grants to make the full amount that we need. And it's kind of an interesting process because we got the chapter authors first because we really needed everyone on board in order to get the grant funding. So I think this is a problem with the procedure or the process, is that we do have to be, as authors, as editors, very confident that we will get the funding somehow. Because that's a lot of money to commit to, and you're getting your authors on board. And then if it didn't work out, then what would you do? So you do have to be very confident that you're going to be able to get the funding.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of challenges or disadvantages and advantages, as you're describing, in terms of how we can have publications that are in OA format, yet at the same time thinking about the hidden costs that are not strictly like out there. When people think of OA, it's like free, and immediately it's out there, but there's actually a lot of labor involved, a lot of sort of stringent requirements that one would have to think about. And as all of you are thinking about this as library workers and librarians in different capacities, thinking about library publishing and whether your institution has a repository or if it's managing a press, and if it's obviously OA in that context, it will go through a lot of similar challenges, and I'm sure this can be applied. Is there anything else you would like to share about the advantages or challenges in the OA route, Lori?
Well, to me, the exciting part is that the moment that we are done with the book, it will be launched online. And so anyone can view it anywhere. Chapters can be downloaded, so it can be shared immediately. And then I think Mays is going to use Amazon Books. and then the books will be printed on demand and sent to libraries so they can have them as well. So that's ultimately what we wanted. We wanted information that was available the moment it was completed. We did go to the Association of College and Research Libraries Press first, which is very standard in the US to use them. And they said, oh, of course we're interested in OA, but after, I think it was a year or 2 years. So they needed to make the profit up front. And then we would not have had to go and find grants and do all of that, but we wanted it open right away, not after a year or two. But I do think, well, as I mentioned to you, Ray, recently, I'm interested in talking to other librarians who have published OA books and finding out how they got their funding and the procedure, simply because it seems to be not a straight path. There's not really a process that seems very, that I've seen that seems like, okay, do this, then do that. And an example there is when we were first brainstorming the idea, I went to the Wikimedia communities, some librarians, and asked for their opinions. And many thought we should just do a DIY, which is do-it-yourself book, where we do the editing, we do the copy editing, the typesetting, we do everything. And honestly, that's a lot of time and money as well. There's a reason you pay people to do that. Because I think cost-wise, in terms of hourly, I think it's actually less expensive to use Maze Press to do that than if we did it ourselves, me and Ray and Roberto. I'm not a professional copy editor, and it takes a special skill to read every single word and chapter for grammar and for the right period, and is everything done correctly. And so I just wanted to hire somebody out for that. And that would be a normal, a standard procedure, but still there's, you know, as we were even talking to people, there weren't a lot of people to talk to who had already done this.
You know, thank you, Lori, for those remarks. And towards this part of the conversation, we want to just give a little more context, and then we'll transition to Q&A. I'm sure folks have a lot of questions about OA publishing and Wikipedia in conjunction to what we do as academic librarians. I think one of the things that has been really challenging is the copyright issue that we're witnessing right now because of COVID-19. It has really created a lot of hurdles, as mentioned in the opening remarks, where a lot of academic libraries are struggling to provide access because they are unfortunately having to lock down because of the situation, and yet everything is all digital controlled lending, finding out ways to provide that sort of support to their scholarly community, students from, you know, all different types of schools, trying to access that content. Yet the publishers are sorting it out with the librarians. And so copyright is a big issue, and this is why open access is so important. Look, when texts are becoming more available through an OA format, then clearly, you know, there will be more opportunities to share resources easily without thinking that we are in violations of international copyright laws and so forth. And the pandemic has really given us an opportunity to reflect on that issue. Now, the other important point to consider is that Wikipedia is an important site, but it's also a controversial site. Not every country around the world allows Wikipedia to be accessible. We have countries, Turkey, China, parts of the UK even, Australia, Germany, etc. They all have a ban on Wikipedia usage. And now this is all obviously for political reasons, from what I can see, but yet it's also very challenging, right? When we're doing this kind of work, that our own project where we're trying to be inclusive and global and have that global perspective, yet we're still not able to get that because some countries don't have access. So of course, then therefore, the libraries there don't have opportunities to use that tool to teach library instruction, utilize the wiki data, and so forth. So there's going to be some of that challenges. But who is most affected the most is really, yeah. Sorry.
Just one little correction.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
So related to Wikipedia and censorship is that some countries used to try to ban individual pages. Mm-hmm. So that's actually what you're referring to when you're talking about Germany and the UK. But Wikipedia several years ago made it so that if you want to ban a page on Wikipedia, you have to ban all of Wikipedia. You can no longer just ban one page or several pages. And so currently it's just China that has banned all of Wikipedia, and Turkey was banned, but they lifted it just a few months ago.
Okay.
And so, but it was the switch to, which I'm not a techie person, but it has to do with switching from HTTP to HTTPS.
Curious.
And so now when it's banned, it has to be the entire Wikipedia. So.
Well, thank you for correcting that, because I had pulled that information from Wikipedia too, and then I needed to look at that more thoroughly. But I guess the conceptual context is that there are challenges, right? We would like to have a lot of examples and opportunities from folks who are doing this kind of work. And so, you know, the folks who are most affected, obviously, would be students and scholars, academic librarians, particularly academic librarians thinking and utilizing this content to develop a framework for their own kind of approach to using Wikipedia in their workplace. Now,
we do have some questions coming in.
Okay, so we can go right into that. Let's do Q&A right now.
Okay. There was a question up at the top about does open access leave authors without an income? And of course, I only know about the process here in the US, but everything from a librarian perspective, everything I write, I don't make any money off of it. So maybe Roberto or Ray could talk to it more, because I'm not totally up to date on how the publisher industry works and how ridiculous the amount of money they make is, Elsevier being the biggest one. But I don't make any money either way. The issue being, with open access, if you still want to typesetting, copy editing, you still need the publisher, and they still need to make enough money to break even. And so that's what Maze is, the arm of University of Michigan. They gave us a price that is just for them to break even, not to make a profit. So that's where the main piece comes in. But as far as professors, almost nobody makes money on the books that they write and publish. You might get a tiny honorarium. I have written a book and I got like $10 a year from it, which is nothing. We will get a tiny percentage from the print of the Amazon books, but again, it's probably going to be $10 to $50, and then we'll turn around and donate it to charity or to Wikipedia or something. So we're not actually making money off of that.
Yep, that is correct. Any other questions we see?
There's a question about how to verify authenticity of Wikipedia entries. And this is actually what I teach in the class. I teach a 2-credit class about Wikipedia, and it's one of the things we go over. And analyzing a Wikipedia article is it's multifaceted, but if you've ever looked at Wikipedia, you'll see there's a talk page and a history page. And if you look at the history page, the amount of edits often indicates how accurate it might be. The studies have found if it's been edited over 700 times, it's probably more accurate. And so the first thing we do in our class is talk about looking at the history page and the talk page and the citations at the bottom of the page to really determine how useful and accurate the article might be. So, but I could go much more into depth, and there's a lot of reading you could do on that topic as well, and there are workshops and stuff. And so as an example, there are editathons that you can participate in, especially now that they're remote. So keep your eye out. The MIT University, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, they're doing an editathon right now at a distance. So they're always onboarding new people so you can learn more about Wikipedia.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks, Lori. Anything to add, Roberto? Okay. Yeah, I was also going to say the Wikipedia editathons are a great way to engage with students who don't normally use Wikipedia or edit Wikipedia. We have done one where I worked as a librarian with women and gender studies, where the students were able to add more entries on specific types of women's issues in Wikipedia, which is very limited. So they were able to use the library reference materials to add that content there. And we were able to learn and understand how important it is to cite your sources and fact check, and also like understand the different types of content that's presented. As Lori said, it's really multifaceted, and it's a great way to instruct and incorporate that kind of research and information literacy skill in such a Wikipedia engagement program. So another question here, how to make the library professionals during pandemic? I think I might need a clarification on that, but does anyone, Roberto or Lori, want to?
Right. Well, I think to do, like, this is a great example of doing webinars and trying to reach out to more people. And so in the current time where our faculty are having to move more online and teach more online, the team that I work with in my library that does our edit-a-thons and that I've taught my class, I'm actually in 3 weeks doing a webinar for our faculty at our university about how to use Wikipedia in the classroom for assignments. So I think there are different things that can be done where we take things online that we maybe wouldn't have thought of or done before.
Yeah, definitely. Like you had mentioned earlier with online Wikipedia edit-a-thons, definitely there's been a lot of universities are doing this. I know another one, University of Southern California Libraries, they do one related to art and architecture, which initially it was supposed to be in person. And then of course, the pandemic happened. All the library services went virtual, including this one. And then so this was the first time to try something distant, and it worked really well because there were still levels of engagements. It's worth considering.
I have a question. Actually, do you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. During the pandemic period, the Springer publishers provided many books free of charge. So this is actually the question is, if you download and are we allowed to put it in our institutional repositories? Because this is not actually the question is not only that most of the Sri Lankan librarians or library professionals have this question, because many of them have asked whether we are allowed to put it in our institutional repositories. So do you have any answer?
So are you asking if you can put in your institutional repositories in Wikipedia?
The books they downloaded into
The books you downloaded?
into the repository. I think that's a copyright issue. But
yeah, I do think it's a copyright issue.
But if it's open access to make it discoverable, right? You technically could put it, but I don't know. I don't know anybody would put another scholar who is not affiliated with the university into the repository. Actually, I had that question the other day because I work at a school library and we have a really small digital collection and we find all these open educational resources. And I thought, oh, why can't we just put them into like our database so we can just use it and share it? But I don't think it works really well that way.
Yeah, and once you have to think about the type of licenses that we have, like for example, for this book, all the authors have agreed to publish this under Creative Commons license just by attribution. So you have to cite wherever they're from, but still the authors retain the rights. This is one benefit of open access that is not like when, at least traditionally, when you sign a deal with the book or you have a chapter in a publication, you give over some of your rights to the publisher. They, in a sense, own the chapter that you wrote. They have access. They have the ability to sell it. But with open access, authors have that right as part of being part of the process. But it really depends. There are some publications that have different licenses, but it's one of those things that it's always gonna have to depend on where they're published, always making sure that the way that you're sharing them corresponds to the way the licenses that those resources you're consulting have.
There's in the other chat, there is another question I see. I'm kind of switching back between the chat and then there's a Q&A. But in the chat, there's a question that says, with OA, especially with those available online, there's a concern that readers of readers with the authority of content. How do you suggest you overcome that suspicion? Really, the question is about authenticity. I'll take a stab at this question and then you two could follow up. So I'll just relate it to the book that we're doing in terms of OA. And when we were looking at publishers, there was another publisher we were considering, which was a little bit more expensive. But my direct supervisor at where I work now, she really wanted us to seek out and find a university press. So that is one thing to consider with OA, is who is behind the OA publication. And so for us with the book, we thought using a University of Michigan publisher would add more authority to the book so that we could say this is who it's coming out of. And then that would help us also get book chapter authors, because they would want to be aligned with a university press as well.
One thing that I would like to add to that is that also looking at the type of process that went into creating that publication, that's also really important. If something has not been peer reviewed, something has not gone through some revision process, that's also a sign that that may not be the best place for you to publish your works. Always looking out for that as well.
Yeah, I certainly think that's important. I know for a fact that with some of the teaching faculty, they are on a tenure track timeline, and it's really relatively fast, because 6 years can easily go by into 1 year. So many of them have decided to avoid sort of open access because it doesn't necessarily follow their tenure requirements. So there's always been that challenge to getting faculty to like adopt into that process. But I see we have another question here. This is for, I believe, Lori and Roberto, maybe you could take it on. Is open access different from Creative Commons licenses?
I'll let Roberto answer.
So thinking about Creative Commons licenses have to do with copyright. So there are different levels of copyright that you can give your publication, I guess. And CC licenses, Creative Commons license, are mostly used when self-publishing work. Open access, it's a way to publish an article, academic work, or other types of work. And in order for you to do that, if you want to retain some of your rights, it's necessary to have some type of license if you wish to. You don't have to. If you don't create a license, there is a possibility that your work would go into the open domain, which at that point, anyone can use it for either profit or other purposes, or even depending on how it's used, claim it out their own. So always, so the distinction there is that, again, open access is a way to publish something, and Creative Commons licenses are the way that you ensure that that information that you published is, I guess, safeguarded from, so that it is used the way that you intended to be used. That's one way to put it.
Yeah, definitely. There is, as probably folks here know, a huge movement on the open access. Like there's Open Access Week that's happening in October 19th to 25th, 2020. What I don't know is if there's a Creative Commons Week or some sort of a similar approach, but that might be worth investigating. Anything to add, Lori, on that? Okay, we can move on to this other question, a comment here. We have asked to not use the Wikipedia for academic writing, thesis, etc. Yeah, this is pretty common, I think, for experiences.
Yeah, I would definitely say generally you're not going to use a Wikipedia article for a thesis, but you can definitely use, as I tell the students, the citations at the bottom, because every good Wikipedia article is well sourced at the bottom of every article. So hopefully you'll be able to get to and see those articles. Some of them may be behind paywalls, which is unfortunate. Of course, well, there was an interesting study I read a couple months ago about Africa, a school in Africa, and they had done an analysis at the university of how many theses in a particular area had cited Wikipedia. And I thought that was an interesting study and something that could be easily repeated at other universities. How often is Wikipedia being cited? I'm not saying it should be. I'm just saying how often is it being cited in theses and dissertations. So I thought that was a very interesting and good study to do. And it's, of course, a great place to start all your research. So when you're thinking about new ideas or bringing things together, I just tell students to go to Wikipedia. And then one of my colleagues, she is an archivist. We have archives in our library, and she actually uses it quite a bit. And she says she's finding better information there than she finds elsewhere. So
that is interesting. And I know for a fact that if you're conceptually looking at the flow of online information and how content is managed or edited, Wikipedia is often a great case study to look at, as many people have done. But then just looking at the translations and then the different types of texts and sources are being used, it's there's a lot of really good research material to work with. And so before we close, I think we have about a few minutes left. I did want to say that for all the attendees here, if you're wondering like what's next, what can you do? Certainly you can stay tuned. Hope the book will come out, as Lori mentioned, next year and in the spring of 2021, and it'll be available for anyone to peruse and to access to get the content. Anything else you want to add, Lori and Roberto?
No, just thank you for coming. And if you're interested in learning more about Wikipedia, I'm sure that there is a Wikimedian in Sri Lanka group, because last year I went to a conference in Spain for Wikimedians, and I spent a lot of time talking to a gentleman from Sri Lanka. So do reach out to local groups, and if you're interested in doing more with Wikipedia and educating people about what it is and how it works, your local organization would be a great place to start.
Definitely.
Thank you very much for your informative presentation. And as there's no more questions, we are going to wind up the session for today. Thank you very much for all of you participants, presentations, Dr. Ray, Lori, and Roberto. The guest of honor, Dr. Rwand Gamake, our esteemed IT team, marketing team, and the library team of Sri Lanka Technological Campus. Thank you very much once again. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay informed. Thank you very much.